Hello and welcome to Flixplained, the channel where we take your favorite flicks and series and break them down to ensure you don't miss a single detail. Today, we're going to be discussing Netflix's series, Wednesday. Specifically, facts and Easter eggs from the show that you might have missed on your first watch through. This goes without saying, but if you haven't seen Netflix's new show yet, and you should, this video is still going to contain spoilers. Tim Burton finally produced an Addams Family project. First off, how amazing is it that Tim Burton finally produced an Addams Family project? And on top of that, he was also responsible for directing 4 out of the 8 episodes. I don't know if you know this, but it's been a very long time coming. Ever since the 1991 Addams Family movie was announced, fans have wanted Tim Burton to work on the project. He was initially announced as the director for the 1991 film, but had to turn it down when the timing conflicted with his filming of Batman Returns. Then again, in 2010, we got our hopes up when we found out that Illumination Entertainment purchased the right to the Addams Family drawings, and was producing a movie that was originally going to be stop motion. Once again, the movie was intended to be directed by Tim Burton, but this time instead of conflicting schedules, the concept was simply cancelled. Thankfully, in 2022, we finally got Burton's hands working on an Addams Family series, and it has been very well received by fans, including myself. The show is filled with Poe references. Next up, if you've seen the first season of Wednesday, then you most likely noticed that the show is jam-packed with references to the great Gothic poet, Edgar Allan Poe. Not only was the school that Wednesday attended in the show named the Nevermore Academy, which is a phrase that Poe made very popular, but they also brung up the idea that the writer actually attended the academy, and that's why he referenced Nevermore so much throughout his poetry. And all I can say is that if there was a school for the dark and dreary outcasts, then I feel like Edgar Allan Poe would have fit right in. There were even references to Poe from the boat race that occurred during the Poe Cup. Each of the team's boat was named after or referenced one of his poems. Bianca's boat referenced the Gold Bug, Xavier's boat was named the Amontillado, Wednesday's boat was named the Black Cat, and the 4th boat had the name the Pit and the Pendulum. Snapped twice. Along with references to Poe, Netflix's gothic comedy was also littered with references to the original Addams Family, as well as almost all of the other interpretations that have been released since. For instance, while at Nevermore, Wednesday discovered that there was a secret society known as the Nightshades. This group of students would hold their secret meetings in a room that was hidden away from the rest of the school, behind a statue of Edgar Allan Poe. And in order to get into that room, Wednesday had to solve a riddle, which led her to discover the magic sound that would open the door for her. That sound ended up being 2 snaps, which is a direct reference to the original Addams Family theme song. Jenna Ortega choreographed the big dance. Next, let's talk about that amazing dance scene in episode 4 of the season, and how Jenna Ortega, the actress who portrayed Wednesday, choreographed that scene. During the Raven dance, Wednesday showed up in a gothic-style dress and blew everyone's minds with her wicked dance moves. The dance is set to the song Goo Goo Muck by the Cramps, and in a recent behind-the-scenes interview, Jenna admitted that she was very nervous about the scene, mainly because she choreographed the dance herself. The actress says she took inspiration from old videos of gothic concerts and raves to ensure that she kept it accurate to the character, and it's clear by the audience's reaction that she nailed it. Homages to the 1960s Addams Family. Another amazing detail from the Raven dance scene is the fact that Jenna decided to incorporate not 1, but 2 references in her dance to former Addams Family cast members. The first was spotted by an eagle-eyed fan that noticed for a brief second, you can see Wednesday bust out a move that the 1960s version of the character did in an episode of the show from way back. During season 2, episode 29 of the 1960s Addams Family TV show, Wednesday tried to teach Lurch to dance, and anyone who noticed it most likely freaked out when they saw our new Wednesday break out the classic dance move. On top of that, almost immediately after, the character transitioned into a dance move that was iconically performed by John Astin, who played Gomez in the 1960s TV series. We've seen Pilgrims in the Addams Family before. Now, if you enjoyed watching Wednesday hate on the Pilgrims, then you should know that her time in Jericho wasn't the character's first run-in with the group. In the very first episode of Wednesday, we got to witness a brawl between our main character and 3 normie kids from town. And it all started because Wednesday couldn't resist educating her fellow teens on what the Pilgrims really did. Well, in the older movie, Addams Family Values, there was a scene where Wednesday was supposed to participate in a Thanksgiving play, where she was supposed to portray a Native American having dinner with the Pilgrims. But instead, she ended up delivering an amazing monologue about the cruelty of the Pilgrims. Real Girl Scouts. Next up, I want to discuss a quote that Wednesday used in the 3rd episode of the series when she said, "I could eat Girl Scouts for breakfast." This was a one-liner that didn't stir up any response, nor did it need to. But fans of the Addams Family movie from 1991 might have recognized that it was a direct reference to a scene from that movie. There was a point in the film when a Girl Scout approached Wednesday's lemonade stand to ask if it was made out of real lemons. Well, later in the movie, Wednesday approached the Girl Scouts selling cookies and asked them if they happened to be made out of real Girl Scouts. It was one of those simple references that we can't get enough of. Pugsley's introduction felt familiar. Up next, let's talk about how familiar Pugsley's introduction to the series was. In the opening sequence of the 1st episode, we see Wednesday opening up a locker at her school and finding her younger brother Pugsley tied up, gagged with an apple, and stuffed inside. In this case, it was because of school bullies that would soon feel the wrath of Wednesday. However, this wasn't the first time that fans of the family have seen Pugsley like this. In the 1991 movie, The Addams Family, the first time we saw Pugsley on screen, he was tied up with an apple in his mouth. Only, in that case, it was because Wednesday wanted to shoot an arrow at him. Wednesday is an amazing archer. This brings us to our next point. Wednesday is shown to be an amazing archer in the Netflix series. This is nothing new for the character though, as we've seen her put her archery skills to use in various other versions of the Addams Family, including the 1991 movie and its sequel Addams Family Values. Though I can't say that any other version of Wednesday ever had the dead-on accuracy that Jenna's portrayal had. The Gargoyles. Next up, did you know the Gargoyles in the Quad of Nevermore Academy each depict a different group or type of student that attends the academy? In the very first episode, we learned that the academy is home to all sorts of outcasts, from Gorgons to werewolves, and according to the production designer, Mark Scruton, each one of these groups is represented by their own gargoyle. In fact, this was one of the first big hints that was dropped about the series, with Scruton saying, "There's a big plot point hidden in there when talking about the gargoyles. Ignatius It." Now, you might not have spotted this next one, but if you look close enough in the Nightshade's secret meeting place, you might have seen another member of the Addams family. In the background, hanging on the wall, is a portrait of Ignatius It. And anyone who saw the original Addams Family TV series would recognize the name from the original lineup. Who was Ophelia? He wasn't the only one who made an appearance though, believe it or not. We also heard the name of Wednesday's aunt. The 1964 series introduced the world to Morticia's sister Ophelia, and you might recall that the dorm that Wednesday was assigned to was her mother's old room in Ophelia Hall, a direct reference to the character from the old series. Miss Thornhill is a familiar face. It didn't take an eagle-eyed fan to catch this next one, but if you recognize Miss Thornhill, it's most likely because she played Wednesday Addams in the 1991 movie and its sequel. Christina Ricci is arguably the most famous and well-known actress to portray the character. Although after watching Netflix's Wednesday, she might have a new competitor with this newer generation of audience members. Either way, both Ricci and Ortega crushed the role in their own very unique ways. The origin of the name. Next up, let's talk about the origin of Wednesday's name and how Morticia finally let us know why they chose to name her after a day of the week. You see, when the Addams Family was originally created back in the 1930s, however, it was time the creator decided to give them distinct names. According to the author, and Morticia, Wednesday's name comes from an old nursery rhyme titled Monday's Child. The rhyme is simple and reads, "Monday's child is fair of face, Tuesday's child is full of grace, Wednesday's child is full of woe, Thursday's child has far to go, Friday's child is loving and giving, Saturday's child works hard for a living, and the child born on the Sabbath day is bonny and blithe, good and gay." Morticia explained that the line, "Wednesday's child is full of woe," seemed to be the perfect fit for her daughter. The showrunners' names appeared in town. Next up, if you know the names of the other showrunners that helped bring Wednesday to life, then you might have recognized them making an appearance in the town of Jericho. Not only was the town filled with shops that were taken out of the original Addams Family cartoons, but if you look closely at the window outside of Dr. Kimbart's office, you'll see the last names of the two showrunners, Alfred Goh and Miles Miller. The weather vanes in the coffee shop. Last but not least, not only did the town of Jericho have references to the showrunners, but the Weather Vanes coffee shop where the villainous Tyler worked at was full of references to Tim Burton. If you noticed, hanging on the walls in the background of the shop were metal weather vanes, hence the name of the coffee shop. Well, it turns out that those weather vanes are all a reference to Burton's previous projects. Those ones shaped like the Headless Horseman, referencing Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, and another shaped like Willy Wonka's hat from when Burton worked on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. That's not all though. In the taxidermy shop, Uriah's Heap, you can also spot a couple of taxidermied mice that are dressed up to look like Tim Burton's characters. Vampires are a very popular species of monster and don't really need much introduction, which might be why they didn't get much focus during the first season of Wednesday. All we really know is that, according to Enid, some of the vampire students have been a part of the academy for decades. Like most depictions of vampires, the fangs at Nevermore are shown to have pale skin and could typically be seen wearing sunglasses to help them ease their interaction with the sun. Gorgons. Next up, let's talk about the Gorgons, or as Enid called them, the Stoners. Gorgons were made famous through Greek mythology and have always been depicted as humanoid beings with coiling snakes on top of their heads instead of hair. The most popular reference Gorgon was Medusa, and she's where most people learned that a Gorgon was capable of turning unwilling onlookers to a solid stone without any chance to react or to run away. At Nevermore Academy, all of the Gorgons were shown wearing hats or bandanas of sorts in order to hide the snakes on their heads, so that other students don't get stoned, and so they don't stone themselves. That actually ended up happening to one of the Gorgons in the show, Ajax, who also ended up being Enid's crush throughout the show. While he was showering, Ajax put a towel on the mirror to cover it so he wouldn't accidentally see himself. But when the towel fell down, he ended up looking right into the snakes on his head and temporarily turned himself into a stone statue. Shapeshifters. Principal Larissa Weems is an odd scenario when it comes to being a magical creature at the Nevermore Academy, and that's mainly because we never explicitly get told what she was. I mean, it was made clear to the audience in the second episode of the series that Weems had the ability to shapeshift into anyone that she wanted to become. We saw this when she was pretending to be Rowan after Wednesday witnessed his murder. Our main character, on the other hand, didn't find out what the principal of the school was until we near the end of season 1. But beyond the fact that she's a shapeshifter of sorts, not much is known about what species Larissa was supposed to be. When it comes to monsters or creatures that could change the shape or the way they looked, there are literally countless across all cultures. From skinwalkers to changelings, Larissa Weems could have been any of those, and who's to say that there aren't any more of her kind throughout the academy, just hiding in plain sight. Sirens. Next up we have the Sirens, otherwise known as the Scales. These mythical creatures had their roots tied to Greek mythology, though they have been since interpreted in a bunch of different ways. Netflix's Wednesday just happened to be the most recent portrayal. Originally, in Greek mythology, sirens were known as half-bird, half-human hybrid, with the human portion being a beautiful maiden. Their appearance has changed though, as the tales have been passed down and adapted, and now the more commonly referenced depiction of a siren is a mermaid-like creature. The one thing that hasn't changed, however, is that sirens can sing an enchanting song that was believed to be capable of controlling a person and even luring them to their deaths. In Tim Burton's Wednesday, the sirens that we met weren't much different from the creatures found in old lore, simply a more modern adaptation. In the series, the clique of sirens is referred to as the Scales because they're all drawn to the various bodies of water around the campus, like the lake or the water fountain, and when they come into contact with any liquids, their human-like skin quickly turns into scales. And thanks to their natural gift of singing, most of the sirens at Nevermore took part in the music clubs for extracurricular activities. Out of the few sirens that we were actually introduced to throughout the season, the most notable had to be Bianca, or as Enid called her, Queen Bee. Bianca was clearly the leader of her clique, and was one of Wednesday's bigger rivals at first. She was seen as the queen of the school and the top of her class, but once we found out how she got there, it all made sense. It turned out that Bianca used her siren song to get into the school, and we even found out that Xavier broke up with her once he suspected that she had been using her power on him. It's clear that the Scales have a lot of control in Nevermore Academy thanks to their ability, so it's a good thing that it seemed like Bianca and Wednesday made up toward the end of season 1. Werewolves. Speaking of the end of Season 1, how lucky was it that Enid was able to finally wolf out? Enid Sinclair was Wednesday's bright and bubbly roommate whose life of blogging gave her all of the juicy details about everything that went on in school and around town. Enid was a member of the werewolf community also known as the Furs. Now, as far as historians can tell, the origin of the werewolf dates back to ancient Greece and Rome and was discovered in ethnographic and philosophical texts. And much like the sirens, the lore had spread across the world and made its way into cultures all around. According to folklore, anyone suffering from lycanthropy was to be considered a werewolf and had the ability to shift its shape into a wolf-like creature. In some cases, a human could become a werewolf after having a curse placed on them, or in other cases, it could be from being scratched by another werewolf and surviving. But in the case of Tim Burton's new series, it would appear that lycanthropy is a genetic trait that was passed down from one familial line. At the Nevermore Academy, the Furs seemed to be like most of the other cliques and mainly spent time with each other. The exception to this detail was Enid, and we found out that's because she wasn't like the other Furs. You see, at the Academy, the werewolves were mainly known for transforming, or wolfing out, when the lunar cycle reached the full moon. Enid, on the other hand, hadn't reached that stage in her development yet, and as of the beginning of the show, she was only able to extend and retract her claws at will. Thankfully, by the end of Season 1, Enid was able to finally wolf out and transformed herself into an awesome looking werewolf that ended up fending off the monstrous Hyde and allowing Wednesday to have enough time to save the Academy. Psychics. This brings us to Wednesday, who is a member of the broadest group of students in Nevermore Academy, the Psychics. The reason that we say that the Psychics were a broad group of students is that there was no real distinction between any of their abilities aside from the fact that they seemed to be passed down through the bloodline. For instance, Wednesday was shown to have psychic visions throughout the season that she ended up using to solve the mystery and save her school. Well, her psychic gift was passed down to her by her mother, Morticia Frump, as well as her great ancestor, Goody Adams. Then there was Xavier Thorpe, who was able to save his psychic powers to animate his artwork and bring them to life. He also mentioned that he had been having dreams that were showing him the future, including a dream that showed a monster attacking the same victims that Wednesday had been seeing in her visions. It was revealed that Xavier's powers were passed down to him by his father and Pugsley's favourite psychic, Vincent Thorpe. Beyond the bloodline trait though, there is really no connection between the psychic abilities, and therefore anyone who had powers but wasn't considered to be part of a different species were likely labelled a psychic. People like Eugene, who was able to use his powers to talk with the bees that he cared so much for, and even command them to attack Miss Thornhill as if he were their queen. Or even like Rowan, who could use telekinesis to move tremendously heavy objects such as the gargoyle that he tried to drop on Wednesday's head in the first episode. He could even move people around, and most likely would have used his powers to kill the goth teenager had he not been brutally murdered himself. Hydes. This brings us to our last monster, the murderer himself, the Hyde. The entire first season of Wednesday revolved around our main character doing everything she could to solve the mystery of who or what had been brutally murdering people around Nevermore Academy, as well as the town of Jericho. And we eventually learned that the monster responsible for these brutal killings was a creature known as a Hyde. The name of the species was determined to have come from the book titled Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with the name Mr. Hyde being a reference to the Doctor's maniacal alter ego. Through her research, Wednesday learned that Hydes were creatures that are born with genetic mutations, and in most cases, that Hyde will remain dormant in an outcast, unless they were placed under the proper circumstances. It was discovered that the only two ways for a Hyde to emerge would be for the outcast afflicted with a mutation to either undergo a traumatic event in their life that awakens that monster, or to have the monster waken up by someone else through the use of chemicals. Under those circumstances, the human who awoke the Hyde would end up becoming its master, and would then gain control over the beast. And when it was revealed that the Hyde tormenting the people of Jericho was none other than Wednesday's love interest, Tyler, we learned that his Hyde had been released through the use of chemicals by Miss Thornhill. We also learned that Hydes used to actually be able to attend Nevermore, and Tyler's mother was one of them. That was until his mum ended up being increasingly violent and unpredictable. This caused her to be kicked out of Nevermore Academy, and ultimately the school ended up banning the species in general. Imagine that, an outcast that wasn't even able to attend the school for outcasts. Though we learned a lot about Hydes as a species throughout the first season of Wednesday, there is still a bunch that we don't know. For instance, when a person is in their hide form, it's hard to tell if they become a mindless killer or if they're actively conscious of their violent actions. Maybe we'll find out when Season 2 comes out. FESTER'S lightbulb trick. First up, let's talk about one of my favourite cameos in the series, Uncle Fester. Fred Armisen's portrayal of the character did not disappoint in the slightest. From his cow print motorcycle and sidecar to his quirky, upbeat yet sinister attitude was everything that fans of the older movies and shows could have hoped for. The biggest difference with the character came from the fact that Fester and Wednesday had the ability to control electricity, which we saw when he tried to bring Thing back to life. This might be an added feature that Fester got for Netflix's new version of the show, but believe it or not, it's also a nod to an old trick that Uncle Fester used to do in the 1960 Addams Family TV series. Multiple times throughout the show, he would do a party trick where he would put the end of a light bulb into his mouth and it would light up, as if he were able to control electrical currents. Well, in Netflix's Wednesday, that's exactly what Uncle Fester could do. A Black Dahlia. The first time that Wednesday interacted with Miss Thornhill, the Normie teacher that turned out to be the mastermind behind the monstrous hide, she gifted our protagonist a very macabre flower, the Black Dahlia. Wednesday loved the gift because of its symbolic connection to the infamous Black Dahlia murder. Elizabeth Short was a woman who was found murdered in Leimert Park, Los Angeles, California back in January 1947. The case was heavily publicized considering the gruesome nature of the crime and the mutilated state that Short's body had been discovered in, after she had been bisected at the waist. The Black Dahlia murder became one of the most infamous unsolved cases in California's history, and after finishing the first season of Wednesday, it's hard not to recognize the fact that Miss Thornhill's gift was a major hint that she was behind all of the gruesome murders that had been happening around the town of Jericho. Hello, Transylvania. Speaking of the town Jericho, if you were like us, you thought that the producers of Wednesday picked the perfect setting to shoot their amazing new series in. Well, that's most likely because, though the show is set in Jericho, it was actually shot in Transylvania. And if that sounds familiar to you, that's because it's the town of Romania that was said to be the home of Dracula after Bram Stoker created the character. It has since been the home of countless horror movies and stories, and as we said, ended up being the perfect location to shoot Wednesday. Kinda kooky. Next, let's take a look at one of the most obvious references to the 1960 Addams Family television series. While they were at the fair in the first episode, Wednesday and Tyler were talking when he explained to Wednesday that to him, she just wasn't scary. Instead, he thought that she was a bit kooky, to which she replied by saying that she preferred the idea of being spooky. And if you don't know by now, that's about as cut and dry as it gets for references. This was clearly a nod at the classic theme song for the Addams Family, which contains the iconic lines, they're creepy and they're kooky, mysterious and spooky. That interaction between Tyler and Wednesday, along with the Snap Twice reference that she used to unlock the entrance to the Nightshade's lair, were both clear references to her family's theme song. Who was Machiavelli? This next easy to miss detail is actually about someone that we learned Wednesday considered to be a mentor of sorts. During the scene at the coffee shop when Wednesday was helping Tyler fix the espresso machine, he was confused at the fact that this teenager who was no older than he was could understand Italian well enough to read the instructional pamphlet for the coffee maker. It was then that Wednesday revealed that she learned Italian because it was the native language of Machiavelli. Now, Niccolo Machiavelli was a political philosopher from the Italian Renaissance whose most famous work was his book The Prince, which was released in 1532. Machiavelli's most famous belief was essential that when it came to ruling a nation or a kingdom, it's better for the ruler to be feared by his subjects rather than to be liked. A mantra that fits Wednesday's character like a glove. Frankenstein reference. Another famous writer, albeit from a slightly more modern era, was Mary Shelley, the author behind Frankenstein. You likely know that the story of Frankenstein is about a mad doctor who sewed together various body parts from corpses and reanimated the newly created body and brought life to Frankenstein's monster. Well, Miss Thornhill must have been a huge fan of the story, because her entire plan was centered around stealing body parts and combining them to create a body for Crackstone's soul to control once she freed him. Wednesday represented Nero as the statue burned. Next up, let's take a look at the scene that we saw Wednesday playing the cello, as the statue of Crackstone burned in the center of town. It's believed that during this scene, Wednesday Addams was supposed to represent Nero, an ancient Roman emperor. Nero was known to be a cruel ruler, who was famous for taking anyone who would stand against him and setting them on fire. One of the most famous rumours surrounding Nero was the idea that he played music in his palace's garden as the rest of Rome burned around him. And though this idea is highly regarded as just a rumour, it's hard not to see the connection as Wednesday continued to play her cello as the rest of the town was sent into a panic around her. Paint It Black. Another amazing musical moment for Wednesday happened toward the middle of the first episode, when we saw her sing out on the balcony in front of a half-stained glass window. She was playing a cello and created the perfect ambiance for the sequence of scenes that were scattered throughout the rendition. Now, you might have recognized the song that Jenna Ortega was playing as Wednesday, and it might go down as one of the best covers of Paint It Black ever to be created. Paint It Black was one of the most popular songs written by the Rolling Stones, and if they saw Wednesday's cello cover of their song, I'm sure they would have been impressed. Edgar Allan Poe and Nevermore. Now, shortly after season 1 of Wednesday opened up, we saw our gothic protagonist getting expelled from a seemingly bright school, which was when her parents decided that she belonged at their old school, the Nevermore Academy for Outcasts. Right away, it was obvious that Nevermore was supposed to be a reference to the most popular gothic author of all time, Edgar Allan Poe. Not only in the name of the school though, they often brought up Poe throughout the series and mentioned that he was one of the most famous alumni of the Academy. On top of that, there was even a statue of him in the school that was used as a secret entrance. They also named the dance after one of his most popular poems, The Raven. Tim Burton's Batman reference. Along with countless Edgar Allan Poe references, Netflix's Wednesday was absolutely packed with references to the show's producer, Tim Burton, and his previous works. My personal favourite, however, had to be the black cat outfits that Wednesday, Enid, and the rest of their team wore during the Edgar Allan Poe competition. At first, you might have thought that they all just dressed up as undead black cats, but when you look at all of the bright white stitching on the deep black outfits, you might recognise that they were paying homage to Michelle Pfeiffer's portrayal of Catwoman in Tim Burton's Batman Returns. A reference to Shakespeare. Next up, let's talk about Ophelia and Shakespeare. We spoke about the name Ophelia and how it was a reference to Morticia's sister, Ophelia Frump. But did you know that there's actually another symbol in the name? When Wednesday first found out that she would be staying in Ophelia Hall, she referenced the Shakespearean play Hamlet. If you're unfamiliar with Hamlet, there's a character in the play named Ophelia who killed herself by drowning. Or at least that's what's assumed. Her death took place offstage in the original play and most of the renditions that followed, though it is widely accepted by the audience that she killed herself to escape her being a part of her family and all of the death and tragedy that surrounded them. The deeper meaning behind Uriah's Heep. Another famous author that was shown love in Netflix's Wednesday was the late Charles Dickens. Not only was Dickens one of Edgar Allan Poe's greatest inspirations, but he also inspired the name of the taxidermy shop in Jericho, Uriah's Heep. Uriah Heep was a fictional character in Dickens's novel David Copperfield. Heep was the main antagonist for the back half of the book. It doesn't stop there though. Dickens was known to dabble in taxidermy and even stuffed his own pet raven after it had passed away. Ajax was a Medusa reference. As you can tell by now, most of the characters' names on Wednesday were symbolic in some way. We found out that Wednesday was a reference to an old poem that Morticia liked, and that the Academy was clearly a reference to Poe. But did you catch the reference hidden in the name of Enid's love interest? Ajax was introduced to us as a Gorgon, and it turns out his connection to Greek mythology goes a bit deeper than that. The name Ajax actually comes from a popular Greek myth where the hero Ajax Telamon led the Greeks through the Trojan War following Achilles' withdrawal from battle. Though he may have lived in Achilles' shadow, Ajax's heroic tale is one that has been passed down for literal centuries. Goody Adams, or Goody Proctor. Last, but definitely not least, let's talk about Wednesday's ancestor, Goody Adams, and her connection to a real woman in history that nearly suffered the same fate that she did. Elizabeth Proctor, also referenced to as Goody Proctor, was involved in the Salem witch trials. She was one of the hundreds of people accused of witchcraft in Massachusetts between 1692 and 1693. Elizabeth ended up being in prison for nearly a year before she was finally released alongside 153 other prisoners, after being set free by the order of the governor of Massachusetts at the time. But by that point, Elizabeth had already been convicted of being a witch, and in the eyes of the law, she was essentially a dead person. Goody Adams shared a strong connection with Goody Proctor, as both were accused of witchcraft and narrowly survived being executed. What did you think about the hidden Easter eggs in Season 1 of Wednesday? Did you happen to catch any that we missed? Make sure you let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to check out our upcoming videos covering the latest and greatest films and series.